afternoon. This is a topic that can easily, you can spend a half day or more on, and I've been asked to do it in 30 minutes. So I'm really going to hit the high points. If anybody has questions as I'm going along, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try to address them, but we may want to hold them till the end and then take them there so that we make sure that we can get through all the materials. I've been working in this area for about 17 years. I'll be talking about public purchasing, public procurement, and bidding on public works projects and contracts. It's a pretty broad topic, so we might as well just get right to it here. The first thing that we're going to cover is purchasing services under Indiana law. We're going to ease into things because this is probably one of the easiest areas of law that I have to deal with. It's under Indiana Code 5-22. Now, I did bring my resources with me, but I figured you didn't want me to spend the half hour reading those two books to you, so I'll just hit the high points, as I said. Services are defined, as you see up there, as the furnishing of labor, time, or effort by a person not involving the delivery of specific supplies other than printed documents that are merely incidental to the required performance. The public owners, your counties, your other political subdivisions, have broad discretion in entering into contracts for services. Basically, they can use, as you see there, any procedure that they consider to be appropriate and negotiate what they consider to be a reasonable fee for those services. So in other words, it's just up to you. A lot of it is up to your discretion. You do have to keep records, and you have to be able to justify your decision if it's challenged. But as long as you can show that you used procedures that you determined to be appropriate and that the fee is objectively reasonable, then you'll pass the test for purchasing services. You don't have to have rules for how you go about entering into contracts for services. It's discretionary under the statute. It says may, there, 522-6-2. However, if you do make a decision that you're going to have rules about how you go about entering into contracts for services, you have to follow them. So you don't have to have rules, but if you have rules, you've got to follow them. You can't have rules and then say, well, in this circumstance, I decided we were going to do it differently. That doesn't fly. So either way you choose to do it is fine. Again, the threshold test, if you used a procedure that you consider to be appropriate, and is it a reasonable fee? Architects and engineers have their own sections of the statute. A public owner can contract for professional services with architects and engineers based upon competence and qualifications of the architect or the engineer that you're entering into a contract with. You have the discretion to make that determination in terms of their competence and qualifications. You have the ability to negotiate compensation, again, as you determine is reasonable. Again, sort of like the rulemaking we had on the last slide, you don't have to give notice of the opportunity. However, if you decide that you are going to give notice, there are certain requirements that you have to have in your notice, including the location of the project, a general description of the project, the criteria that you'll be using in selecting the architect or engineer, where additional information about the project can be obtained, the business hours of your agency, and the last date that you'll accept statements of qualifications from a design professional. So again, not required, but if you decide that you're going to provide notice, then those are the things that are required. Construction managers also have their own provisions under the code. There are two types of construction managers. There's basically a construction manager at risk that looks a lot like a general contractor that holds contracts with subcontractors and manages the work in that way. And then there's what's called a construction manager agent, who really is more of an advisor to the owner. The Indiana Code allows that second one. You can retain somebody to act as essentially the owner's agent to help manage the project. There are a couple of restrictions in terms of who can be retained as a construction manager on a public project. As you see up there, one, it can't be the same architect or engineer who designed the project. There are limitations. You can't have the same firm or person acting in both capacities. Two, and this was what I was talking about, you can't have a construction manager at risk. The construction manager can't compete for, be awarded, or perform any portion of the construction work or hold any contracts with any of the subcontractors. So the construction manager has to be separate from the general contractor, who we'll talk about in a little bit here when we're talking about the public bidding laws. Other than that, though, again, you can negotiate terms with the construction manager, and you can select a construction manager based on qualifications and competence. You also don't have to give notice, but like with architects and engineers, if you decide to give notice, you have to include all those same things that are contained on the last slide. One thing I wanted to mention here in terms of, and this applies whether you're contracting for services with a professional or whether you're entering into a project with a general contractor to perform the public works, and that is the E-Verify program, which has now been on the books for either a year or two now. Basically, all public contracts entered into by a political subdivision or state agency have to contain certain provisions that comply with the federal E-Verify program, which is set up to try to prevent employment of unauthorized aliens in the United States. There are certain provisions that have to be included in the public contract, stating that the contractor or the service provider participates in the federal E-Verify program, that they do not knowingly employ anyone who is an unauthorized alien in the United States, or subsequently, if they find out that one of their employees is an illegal, they cannot retain that person as an employee or an independent contractor. There also has to be an affidavit that they provide, which is usually attached as an exhibit to the contract, affirming those things, that they don't knowingly employ anybody who's an illegal alien, and that if they find out, and that they participate in the federal E-Verify program, that they find out that they are employing someone who's an illegal, they will terminate that person. Moving on, procurement of supplies. First of all, does anybody have questions about contracting with service providers? Yes, sir.
Can you use extended services from an architectural service to help oversee that project with you instead of a construction manager?
Yeah, you don't have, right, you don't have to have a construction manager. In fact, you know, if some of you have ever dealt with kind of the form construction contracts, a lot of people in our industry use the AIA documents. Those documents actually sort of contemplate that the architect is going to act something as an owner's representative or overseer of the project, and that's fine. You don't have to have a construction manager. If you want to just use the architect to perform services, you know, of that nature, that's fine as well. But they can't, there are certain distinctions between a construction manager and architect, and that's why when it talked about you can't have the same person in both roles, that's the reason why. Any other questions? Okay. Purchasing of supplies. Supplies are defined as equipment, goods, and materials, a nice broad definition that covers just about anything that you may need to purchase. Basically, there are 4 procedures that are available for purchasing supplies. One, competitive bidding, 5-22-7. It's similar to what we're going to talk about here about competitive bidding for public works projects. The key terminology is that you award the contract to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. I'm going to turn to my notes now here so I can cover that a little bit in more detail. The invitation that you put out there under competitive bidding has to contain certain things, including the description of what is being purchased, all contractual terms that will apply to the purchase, a statement of the evaluation criteria that will be used to evaluate bidders as to whether or not they are responsible, the time and place when bids will be opened. Bids must be opened publicly. A statement of whether the bid must be accompanied by a certified check or other evidence of financial responsibility. That goes to the responsible bidder component there. And also a statement under which the conditions, under what conditions the bid may be canceled or rejected. Notice has to be published at least twice, 1 week apart. with the first publication no more than 6 weeks before the bid date and the second at least 7 days before the date when bids will be received. And that notice also has to specify the date, the time, and the place when the bids will be opened. Sort of the overarching theme that you'll pick up on as I go through this is all of these statutes are intended to protect the taxpayer, and everything has to be done open and publicly and in a way that any interested taxpayer can come and sit in to see how their tax dollars are being used and whether or not they're being used consistent with the statutes and being used in the most efficient manner. The bids will be open publicly and can only be evaluated on the criteria set forth in the invitation to bid. As I said, it has to be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and I'll talk in a little bit about what those two terms, responsive and responsible, mean. Rules can be adopted for correction or withdrawal of erroneous bids. If the board chooses to do that, they have to reject or allow a bid to be withdrawn. You have to have a written decision as to the basis for why you decided to do that, again, justifying if, for example, if you don't end up using the lowest bid, why it is that you did not. If a bidder inserts additional terms into its bid, it can be deemed non-responsive, or you can allow the additions to be accepted provided they aren't prejudicial to fair competition, that there's, again, a stated reason in writing for why any additions to the bid or additional terms are going to be accepted on behalf of the political subdivision. The second method for purchasing supplies is the invitation for quotes under 5-22-8. Those can be used for smaller purchases under $150,000. Their quotes can be invited from at least 3 potential suppliers, at least 7 days advance notice for the invitation, and again, the public entity can either accept the lowest responsive and responsible quote, or you have the discretion also to reject all quotes. In the circumstance, if no quotes are received, then you can move on to one of our other sections we'll talk about making special purchases. So if you put the invitation out there and nobody responds, it doesn't mean that you don't get to make the purchase. It just means then that you can do it more as you see fit. Any questions on either of those two methods of purchasing supplies? Request for proposals is method number 3. If you make a written determination that doing competitive bidding isn't practical or advantageous to the county, then you can use the method of doing requests for proposals. The owner can establish, again, the selection criteria and have to make those criteria known in the RFP that's put out. Price is a factor, but unlike in the other scenarios, it's not the controlling factor. You'll hear me use the term lowest bidder. Here, it can be a factor, but it doesn't have to be the controlling factor. So you don't have to necessarily use the lowest responder to the RFP. Once you receive the responses to the RFP, the statute allows for negotiation at that point for terms and for price, although disclosing one competitor's offer to another is prohibited under the statutes. You have to prepare a register of the proposals that's kept in a file for public inspection. Again, everything has to be out in the open and available to the taxpayers. And the award is to be made then to the offerer whose proposal is determined in writing to be the most advantageous to the governmental body. Again, kind of use a reasonable man standard of why do you consider this to be the most advantageous of all the responses to the RFPs that you received? And as long as you can justify that in writing, then you're on solid ground. The final method of purchasing is under 5-22-10 in the Indiana Code. That's special purchases, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago. For example, if you don't get any responses or quotes. Normal procurement procedures can be avoided in special cases, for example, emergencies, and you have to have a written determination by your board that an emergency exists for why you need to make a special purchase, sandbags or something like that if you have a flooding, something of that nature. If you can show that there are going to be particular savings to the county that have to be, that can only be taken advantage of on a one-time basis, for example. Purchases made at auctions don't have to go through the other procedures. If there's a single source supplier for what you're purchasing, you don't have to go through the other procedures. You can use that single source. As I mentioned before, if you don't have any offer or quote under the other procurement methods that we talked about, similar to savings to the county, you've got a government discount provision and also gifts. The county can accept gifts, not that you're necessarily going to be getting a lot of them. So it's in the statute, but I've never had anyone have any questions with respect to that. So those are the four general methods for procuring supplies. Does anybody have questions on any of that before we move on to the next topic? Okay. Public Works projects. This is under Title 36 of the Indiana Code, 36-1-12, sets forth all the provisions for competitive bidding under public construction projects. The general goal of the statute, and with the purchasing statutes as well, but especially it's been articulated that the goal of the Public Works statute in Indiana is to safeguard the use of public funds, to prevent fraud, favoritism, graft, extravagance, and corruption by ensuring honest competition for the best work at the lowest reasonable costs. So, again, the whole idea of the statute here is, are we using the taxpayers' dollars in the best way? Are we using them to purchase the lowest, to get the lowest price for work that we think will be both responsible and is responsive to what we need to have done? Public work is defined in the statute as the construction, reconstruction, alteration, or renovation of a public building or other structure that's paid for out of a public fund or out of a special assessment. It includes constructions and alterations and repairs of highways, streets, bridges, sewers, and other improvements paid for out of either a public fund or a special assessment. So it's a pretty broad category of things that fall under the definition of what is a public work. And you have to keep that in mind, because if you do have to have public work performed, you do have to follow the statutory procedures that we're about to discuss here. Competitive bidding, the statute is 36-1-12-4. That talks about if the project is going to be at least $150,000, and these days I think you'll find that most projects of any size are going to cost in excess of $150,000. If it is, then you have to follow the statutes. The public owner develops plans and specifications, usually with an architect or engineer that's been retained. Those cannot unduly limit competition. In other words, you can't develop specifications for a project that basically are going to mean that only one supplier or bidder is going to be able to respond to. There are cases out there in Indiana talking about, for example, swimming pools and special systems where there were in the specifications that it had to be done a certain way and that there was only one supplier of that system in the Midwest, and so ultimately found that they didn't follow the statutes because the plans and specs unduly limited competition. Competition is seen as being good and in the public interest, so that again is the goal of the public works statutes. Those plans and specs have to be made available and accessible to the public as specified in the invitation to bid. Anybody who may be interested, and any taxpayer who may be interested in the project, has to have an opportunity to come in and inspect what the plans are for that project. And then there has to be published notice soliciting bids for the project. It has to be published at least twice, at least 1 week apart, and the date between the first notice and the bid date may not be more than 6 weeks if the cost is less than $25 million, and not more than 10 weeks if the estimated cost of the project is at least $25 or more. The second publication has to be at least 7 days before the bid date, and the notice again has to specify where the plans and specs are on file, the place, date, and time when bids will be received. It has to be put out there generally in a publication of general applicability in your county, wherever you may be in the state. So again, everybody who may be an interested bidder has a fair and equal chance to review the project, and if they so desire, to submit a bid on that project. Bidders have certain requirements of what they have to submit with their bid. They have to provide a State Board of Accounts Form 96, which includes a financial statement, a statement of their experience, their proposed plan for performing work, and what equipment that bidder has available for performing the work. Again, as we'll talk about here in just a minute, one of the things that they have to show is that they are a responsible bidder, meaning that they have to show that, in fact, if given the contract for the work, they are responsible and can perform that work. Not just anybody can walk in off the street and say, yeah, I can do that for, $1 less than this guy. And, yeah, I've never done it before, but how hard can it be? Now, you have to be able to show that you've got the financial capability, the experience, and the expertise to do the work, and that's what the Form 96 is for. Bidders also have to submit a non-collusion affidavit under the Indiana Code. Again, as I talked about, the goal is to prevent fraud, cronyism, collusion, graft, whatever graft may be. So in other words, you can't have bidders that get together and say, okay, I'll let you be low on this one, and I'm going to be low on next one, and we'll just go back and forth, and we'll have a little deal on the side that we make sure that we get enough work. You can't do that. You have to submit the affidavit that you haven't colluded with anybody else with respect to your bid. There has to be a bid bond or a certified check. If the project is at least $200,000, it's optional. If the project is a cost of under $200,000, the bid bond is there in case the low bidder who gets the contract ultimately pulls out and you have to take the second low bidder. The bond is there to cover the price differential between those two bids so that the county doesn't suffer the shortfall by having to go to the second low bidder in case the low bidder pulls out. Bids are to be opened publicly and read aloud at a designated time and place. And that is somewhat strictly construed, that once the bid time arrives and they're read aloud and opened, you can't accept any additional bids. I've seen cases where somebody came in literally 10 minutes afterwards and handed in their bid, and they refused to open them and refused to reward the contract, regardless of whether or not that may have ended up being the low bid. You have to make it there by the bid time and by the time that the bids are opened and read aloud publicly. The award of the contract is to be made to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder, or you have the discretion to reject all bids. If you get all the bids in and all of them are at a price much higher than you expected, or which you don't have the budget or resources for, you do have the authority to reject all bids and not go forward with the project. Or you could reject all bids and rebid the project if you so desire. But if you're going to award the contract, it has to go to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. The factors to be considered in whether or not a bidder is responsive. Does the bid or quote conform in all material respects to the specifications? It's not necessarily a mirror image. It doesn't have to respond in every single respect exactly, but as long as it substantially complies and doesn't have any material deviations from the plans and from the specifications for the project, that is one thing to look at. Does the bid comply with the invitation to bid and the instructions to bidders? Have they provided everything and all the information that the invitation to bidders required? And does the bid otherwise comply with all statutes, ordinances, resolutions, or rules that you may have on file? If so, then a bidder has submitted a responsive bid. In other words, are they bidding on the same project that we intend to build? You don't want somebody bidding on something completely different and then making an issue out of it. The other factor, is it a responsible bidder? Do they have the ability and capacity to perform the work? Is the bidder someone with the integrity, character, and reputation that we approve of? In the political subdivision or county can also look at the competence and the experience of the bidder. So, for example, if you have a number of projects and you keep getting bids from a certain contractor and consistently they're unable to perform the work and you always have problems, you may have a basis then for determining that a bidder is not a responsible bidder and therefore not eligible on certain projects based on certain bids that they provide. Responsive and responsible are threshold tests and can't be used to rank bidders. In other words, there's no, this bidder was the most responsible or the most responsive. It's kind of an on-off switch. Either a bidder's responsible or not. Either a bidder's responsive or not, either a bidder's responsible or not. If you check yes to both of those boxes, then they go on and get put in the same pool then of bidders that then you're going to look at their price to see if they've provided the lowest bid. So there's no discretion in terms of they're more responsive or we want to use this bidder because they're more responsible even though their price is a little bit higher. It's an on-off switch. Are they responsive? Are they responsible? If so, then they can be considered. See, there's a quote there. Definition of a responsible contractor suggests the determination for responsibleness is to be made independently for each bidder and not in comparison with one another. You can't make comparisons of bidders to determine responsibleness, etc. Now, if the public owner, after opening all the bids, awards the contract to someone who is not the apparent low bidder, in other words, the apparent low bidder was either not responsive or not responsible. I always got to make sure I get both of those. You have to state in writing in your minutes of a meeting at the time of the award the factors used to determine which was the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. In other words, why didn't we take the lowest price? You have to state some justification for why, if you have a low bidder who is not responsible or you have a low bidder who is not responsive, you have to state that in writing. Again, since you're using the taxpayer's dollar, they have a right to know why you didn't take the lowest bid. You have to keep a copy of those minutes or a memorandum for public inspection in case anybody has questions. Additional requirements for public works projects under the statute. Contractors have to provide payment and performance bonds. If you hit a certain threshold for work, $200,000. Payment bonds in case general contractor isn't making its payments to its subcontractors or suppliers, they have a right to go against the bond for payment. Under the Indiana statutes, on a public works project, there is no mechanics lien remedy, so that you can't put a mechanics lien on public property. So the payment bond stands in place of a lien. So again, if you have a subcontractor or supplier who's not getting paid by the general contractor, they have a right to try to seek payment off the performance bond. The payment bond, or on the payment bond, the performance bond, if the general contractor is unable to perform, the owner then can make a claim against the performance bond to pay for having a substitute contractor come in and complete the work again so that the county taxpayers don't have to suffer that burden. On public works projects, there has to be a prevailing and common wage if the project is for $250,000 or more. As of the first of the coming year, the threshold will increase to $350,000. So if the cost of the project exceeds that, they have to show that they're paying what's called a common or prevailing wage on the project, and each of those are determined by county in terms of what is the common or prevailing wage for projects in that county. Retainage on public works projects, you'll see there no more than 10% or less than 6% until the public work project is 50% complete, and then no retainage thereafter, or throughout the entire term of the project, it can be no more than 5 and no less than 3. You have the option of how you do that, except if it's a highway, road, street, bridge project there, you'll see then retainage requirements are excluded. Change order limitations. Each construction project that you have is probably going to have a change order of some sort. It's just the general nature of construction. Things change, conditions change as you're going with that throughout the project. You don't have to have another public bid as long as the change order is limited to 20% or less of the original contract price. And that's usually a pretty good sized number. So 20% doesn't seem that large, but it typically is. The idea there is you can't go through the bid process and then issue a change order to substantially change the project and increase the project by, half, and use the same bidder that went through the public bid process. If you do have a change order that's going to cost more than 20% of the original contract price, you have to go back then and independently bid that with the procedures that we talked about before. It's important to note, too, by the way, that you can't divide up contracts in such a way. We talked about the threshold dollar limits to just come within those. In other words, we're going to do this in phases, so no one of them reaches $200,000, so we don't ever have to use the public bidding. If you set up your project in such a way that it appears the only intent of doing it is to avoid having to comply with the public bid statutes, that's not going to fly. It'll be subject to having the contract rescinded. There are some alternatives to a full competitive bid. Use of the owner's own workforce. If the project is under $150,000, you can purchase and lease materials, as we discussed before, and then perform the public work with your own workforce. You have to be able to show, though, that you have a workforce that's capable of performing the constructions, maintenance, and repair applicable to that work. Again, in determining the $150,000 limitation, you have to consider the cost of the materials, labor, equipment rental, reasonable rate for use of trucks, heavy equipment, and all other expenses incidental to the performance of the project. So if you take all that into consideration and you're still under $150,000, you would have the option to self-perform instead of to bid that work out. It has to be inspected and accepted as complete in the same manner as a bid project. And again, you can't artificially divide up the project to bring it under that section. In other words, we're going to divide this up into sections, and each one stays under $150,000, so we can just use our own workforce and never have to publicly bid it. That is prohibited. Small dollar projects under $150,000, you can do a quote procedure. You see there, notice has to be mailed out not less than 7 days before the time fixed for receiving quotes. Again, quotes have to be opened publicly and read aloud. The price preferences, you can strike that. This PowerPoint needs to be updated. There was, for 1 year, a section in the Indiana Code that allowed for certain preferences for local bidders. That has now been removed from the statutes. If the project's under $50,000, the owner rejects all quotes, establishing in writing the reason therefor. You can negotiate and enter into agreements for the work on the open market without inviting or receiving any new quotes. And if it's under $25,000, you can solicit 3 quotes by telephone or by fax, and you don't even have to give the 7-day notice requirement. So the lower the project cost, the more flexibility you have in terms of contracting for that work. Routine maintenance is allowed for. If you're estimated to be under $150,000, you can do it the same way we talked about in terms of purchasing supplies. And if there's an emergency, there's a provision for that too. There has to be a public declaration of emergency by the board. You can invite quotes from 2 persons, and the board minutes have to reflect the emergency declaration and identify the persons invited to provide quotes. I know I'm going through this kind of quickly. Does anybody have any questions on public bidding? See how I'm doing on time here. In general, public boards have fairly broad authority once you've determined that somebody is a responsive and responsible bidder. Broad authority and discretion to enter into contracts. Public authorities are vested with discretion. Their decisions aren't to be interfered with in the absence of collusion or fraud. The decision of a board in terms of a responsive and responsible bidder can't be overturned unless it's found to be arbitrary, corrupt, or fraudulent. And courts, this is important, cannot substitute their own judgment for that of public boards, and they will only be reversed, again, arbitrary, illegal, corrupt, or fraudulent. It's not unlimited, however, as we talked about. The extent of judicial relief, I don't think we're going to have time to quite get into bid protests or bid errors, but it's important to know this, that if the bid is challenged or the award of the contract is challenged, that either the statutes weren't complied with or that the contractor that the contract was awarded to was not truly responsive or responsible, the extent of judicial relief is to enjoin the work being done on the project, issue an injunction to stop the work, and then to vacate the decision and remand it to the public owner for further consideration. It's important to know that a court cannot assume the duties of awarding a contract. That is left with the public owner, your discretion in terms of how the contract is to be awarded. So if there's a lawsuit brought that's challenged, the judge can't say, for example, no, contract shouldn't go to this bidder, it should go to your second low bidder. All a court can do is say, that contract is void, you have to rebid the project. So judges can't award contracts, only the public boards can award contracts. It's that old separation of powers between the judicial and administrative branch. So bid errors and bid protests, I think, are, we're not going to have time to get to them. As I said, this could take a whole half day if we wanted it to, but it is in the PowerPoint materials you have as part of your packets. And if anybody has any questions, I feel like I kind of flew through that quickly, but if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to address them at this point.